To our top story, the Culture Secretary has warned social media companies that they will face multi-million-pound fines unless they stop underage children accessing their services.
The move forms part of the government's revamped online safety bill, which will be unveiled today following a series of delays.
The new version of the bill has also dropped controversial plans to put restrictions on content deemed legal but harmful.
Well, joining us now for more analysis is the Deputy Editor of the online newspaper CapX, Alys Denby. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Feels like we've been talking about this online safety bill, for as long as I can remember, half a decade or so. But significant changes are being made. And do you think that they will go through and that they are the right changes?
I think it's worth zooming out to where this bill started from. It was in response to the very tragic and awful suicide of a 14-year-old girl, Molly Russell, and this made the government feel something must be done about what children are doing online. And since then it's spiralled into kind of trying to break up big tech, trying to on the one hand promote and on the other hand kind of prevent people being offended by content online. So it's taken on a lot of different aspects, and I think this is yet another kind of incarnation. They seem to be pivoting back to the focus on child protection. My worry here is that responding in this way to an awful but rare event is a bad basis on which to be making legislation. And I'm also a bit concerned that we might be behaving a bit like sort of parents in the 50s that were worried about the moral threat of Elvis Presley. Because, you know, we didn't grow up with this kind of technology, but kids today are far more savvy about it than we are. I think it's natural as parents to be worried about what our children are doing online, but is there a risk of going too far?
Yeah, and I'm going to be really curious to speak to Ms Donnellan about this, because I've spoken with 50,000 kids across Britain about the threats of online pornography, and simply what they tell me all the time is they know how to get around all these things. Children are much more tech savvy than adults. Is this just nanny state politics and it's really going to be ineffective?
I think there's an aspect of that. I think there's also an aspect of parental responsibility here. I mean, I saw a statistic that something like 30% of 5-year-olds have social media accounts. I mean, clearly their parents are helping them to do that and their parents are giving them phones. So I do think that there's an aspect of the state trying to put a genie back in the bottle when it comes to big tech. And there's a risk here. Michelle Donnellan spoke in her Telegraph article about wanting to sort of break up the power of Silicon Valley. But actually, this is going to have the opposite effect, because it's going to be the big companies like Meta and Google that are able to have the lawyers and the compliance officers needed, and smaller competitors that might come and challenge them won't be able to do that. So
but as you say in your first answer about the need to zoom out and the rarity of the case of Molly Russell, I mean, it was the Children's Commissioner recently talking about the high percentage of 11 to 15-year-olds who had witnessed decapitations online, and the access to porn now being of children of primary school age being commonplace, 75% of under 11-year-olds having seen it. The idea that we have to protect freedoms above what our children are seeing. A lot of people, particularly people who are concerned about children's welfare, say we have no idea what the implications will be on our young in 20 to 30 years' time. And we'll probably be a bit like with the smoking ban, look back on it and think, how on earth did we not address this more rapidly sooner?
But there's also a chance that we might look back and think, was this all a moral panic, that, you know, technology changes but human nature doesn't change, and that we are going too far. But I do think that it's welcome that, as I said, Michelle Donnellan seems to be pivoting back to the original intention of the bill, of being about protecting children and not about policing speech online. She's changed this provision about legal but harmful speech, so it's no longer going to be, as I understand, a case of the platforms having to remove it. There's going to be options to filter it out for adults. So I think that's welcome. But again, I also think that that's a consequence of the kind of troubled progress of this bill. It's been through so many different incarnations. You know, how confident is the government that this is the version that's going to make it through when so many previous versions haven't?
As well as children lying their way around this and just bluffing about their age, and parents helping out with accounts, isn't this just a case of, you know, prohibition never works? If you tell a kid they can't do something, they tend to go and do it immediately in even greater numbers. Isn't a more sensible solution to have a conversation about critical consumption? But that's too awkward for the government, isn't it?
Yeah, I do. Again, I say I think that there's this idea of personal responsibility within families and for parents to have these kind of conversations with their children. And that's a difficult thing for the government to be talking about. Far easier to say it's big tech's fault, it's Silicon Valley.
And how can the tech companies themselves police this? But how are they meant to know the age of people coming in unless they start asking for things like ID? And surely that's a whole can of worms then about the extra data they hold about people.
Yeah, I do worry about how this is going to work in practice. I'm sure every parent would like it to be the case that if a site is for over 18s only, then their kids can't access it. But as you say, how do you police this?
Let's talk about China, shall we? Because